The fundamental characteristic of ideologies is their normative character, the emphasis on the ought to be. All other elements of their discourse, no matter how dense or sparse their descriptive, analytical, or explanatory content may seem, contribute to this end and are determined by it, to the point that the adopted norms and values retroactively decide the profile of the described reality, and not the other way around. This does not mean that ideologies lack rationality. On the contrary, they are rational edifices, sometimes masterpieces of logical argumentation, but built on evaluative premises and selective choices that can never be questioned. Hence, as A. James Greger, the great scholar of the modern revolutionary phenomenon, says, ideological discourse is deceptively descriptive. When it seems to be talking about reality, it does nothing more than seek surfaces of contrast and support points for the better world, whose realization is its objective and reason for being. If a citizen opts for socialism, he will describe capitalism as predecessor and adversary, suppressing everything in capitalist society that cannot be described in these terms. If he chose the Enlightenment view of democracy as the child and culmination of scientific reason, he will describe fascism as pure irrational truculence, suppressing from history the decades of fascist argumentation, as rational as any other ideological discourse that prepared Mussolini's advent to power. With this in mind, the most obvious thing in the world is that none of my writings and nothing I have taught in class has ideological character, and that describing me as a right-wing ideologist, or ideologist of whatever, only works as a defamatory pejorative, an attempt to reduce me to the mental stature of the dwarf who thus labels me. They can look in my books, articles, and classes. They will find no speculation about the good society, much less a model of it. At most, I may have subscribed here or there, in passing and without paying much attention, to this or that minor normative precept in economics, education, electoral politics, or any other specialized field, without any attempt to articulate them and much less systematize them into a general conception, into an ideology. This should be clear to anyone who knows how to read, and indeed it would be if the fusion of functional illiteracy, malice, and rustic fear of the unknown did not form that indissoluble and unalterably foul-smelling compound that constitutes the forma mentis of our opinion-makers nowadays. I refer, of course, to the most popular and flashy, and to their vast audience of repeaters in the blogosphere universe, not to the honorable though obscure exceptions, of which I find some examples in this same Diario do Comercio. It is obvious that these people are incapable of reasoning in the key of descriptive discourse. They do not say a word that is not to take a position, or better, to display a flattering self-image before readers, needing, for that, to contrast it with some hateful anti-model that, if not found, must be invented with mockery, puerile caricatures, and scraps of appearances. The most important thing in life, for these creatures, is to personify under the spotlight some values considered good and desirable, such as democracy, human rights, constitutional order, defense of minorities, etc., placing on the antipodes of these excellent things any word they dislike. Some of these individuals had their personalities so completely swallowed by these conventional symbols of good that they come to take any complaint, insult, or criticism directed at their distinct persons as an attack against democracy, a virtual coup d'etat. The desire to personify beautiful things such as democracy and constitutional order is so intense there that, in the confrontation between left and right, the two sides accuse each other mutually of being coup plotters and fascists. No better proof that these are mere ideological discourses could be demanded. On my part, my political writings are divided between the search for scientifically founded descriptive concepts and the application of these concepts to the diagnosis of concrete situations, sometimes complemented by prognoses which, over more than 20 years, have never failed to come true. Of these two parts, the first is documented in my class handouts, especially from the courses I taught at PUC Parana, the second in my newspaper articles. Readers of the latter do not have direct access to the theoretical foundation, but find in them sufficient indications that it exists, that these are not opinions thrown into the air, but, as Martin Pagnon observed, political science in the strict sense understood by his master and friend, Eric Voegelin. There is not, among the most praised opinion makers in this country, journalistic, or academic. A single one who has the required capacity, much less to discuss this material, but even to apprehend it as a whole. There I describe things as I see them through scientific instruments of observation, caring little whether I will give the impression of being a Democrat or fascist, socialist, neocon, Zionist, traditional Catholic, Gnostic, or Muslim. So much so that I have already been called all those things, which in itself already shows that the labelers are not interested in diagnoses of reality, but only in inventing, in what they read, the hidden profile of friend or enemy, to know whether, in the ideological struggle, they should praise or ridicule him. The very variety of ideologies attributed to me is clear proof that I do not subscribe to any of them, but speak in a key whose comprehension escapes the narrow horizon of consciousness of the ideologists who today occupy the entire space of the media and university chairs. Their hysterical and hateful reactions, their fake poses of Olympic superiority, their malicious and puerile inventiveness, their theatrical caresses of paternalistic condescension interspersed with perfidious insinuations, are the living symptoms of a monstrous collective ineptitude, as never seen before in any time or nation. What in this country is called political debate is of an indescribable intellectual misery, which by itself already provides sufficient explanation for the national failure in all domains: economy, public security, justice, education, health, international relations, etc. I say this because the talking intellectuality marks the maximum breadth and altitude of the consciousness of a people. Its incapacity and baseness, which I have been documenting since the times of O Imbecile Coltivo, 1996, but which after that time jumped from alarming to calamitous, and from there to catastrophic and infernal, reflect in the mental and moral degradation of the entire population. Of all human goods, intelligence, and intelligence means nothing more than consciousness, is distinguished from the others by a peculiar distinctive trait. The more we lose it, the less we notice its lack. There the most obvious connections of cause and effect become an inaccessible mystery, an unthinkable esoteric secret. Disjointed and absurd conduct then becomes the general norm. For 40 years, Brazilians have let, without complaining, their country become the largest consumer of drugs in Latin America, have let their schools become centers of communist propaganda and brothels for children, have let, without complaining, their higher culture be replaced by the empire of semi-literate frauds, have let, without complaining, their traditional religion prostitute itself in the bed of communism, and run to seek fictitious shelter in improvised pseudo-churches where false miracles were sold at high prices, have let, without complaining, their brothers be murdered in increasing numbers, until the entire nation was afraid to go out on the streets and began to imprison itself behind gates powerless to protect it, have let, without complaining, the government take their weapons and even hasten to hand them over, leaving their families unprotected, to show how good and obedient they were. After all that, they discovered that politicians were embezzling public funds, and then exploded in a cry of revolt. No, nobody touches our rich and holy money. The popular rebellion against the comunalarepios, communist thieves, does not arise from any legitimate moral indignation, but emanates from the same money-minded mentality that inspires the most cynical corrupt. Not only money is the highest value there, perhaps the only one, but everything seems inspired by the rule. I want it too, or else I'll tell everybody. It is obvious that if this mentality did not prevail in our social milieu, corruption would never have risen to the stratospheric levels reached with Mensaleo, Petroleo, etc. Hatred of evil is not a sign of goodness and honesty. It is part of the dialectic of evil to hate itself, to wage war on itself, and to proliferate by fissiparity. The most significant thing of all is that such a patent, visible, and scandalous phenomenon of moral teratology does not even deserve a little comment in a newspaper, when it should be the subject of 1,000 sociological studies. Do you want a greater proof that the luminaries of the media and universities have no interest whatsoever in knowing reality, but only in promoting their damned ideological agendas? It was for this reason that, more than 20 years ago, I reached the conclusion that any political solution to the country's ills was, from the root, unfeasible due to the futile and perverse nature of public discussions. There was only one way, difficult and laborious, but realistic, to change for the better the course of things in this country, and this course did not pass through political electoral action. It was necessary to follow, without stopping, without rushing, and without retreating, as Paulo Mercadante taught, the following steps. 1. Revitalize higher culture, training young people so they could produce works worthy of what Brazil had until the 1950s, 60s of the last century. 2. Thus sanitize the publishing market and cultural media, gradually creating a new environment of high culture consumption and thereby cleansing public debates. 3. Sanitize the mainstream media through pressure, boycott, and occupation of spaces. 4. Sanitize the religious environment, Catholic and Protestant. 5. Finally, raise the level of political debate, making it touch on the realities of the country instead of getting lost in immaterial cliches and empty rhetorical phrases. This last step would not be reached in less than 20 or 30 years, but there is no magic path, no political solution, no saving ideological formula. Either all these steps are taken, with patience, determination, and firmness, or everything will be nothing but a pathetic succession of premature ejaculations. This is the project to which I have dedicated my life, and of which the articles I publish in the media are but a partial and fragmentary sample. To imagine that I did everything I did just to create a right-wing movement is, at best, an intolerable stupidity. As for item number 1, do not be impressed by the rushers who, having superficially absorbed some of my teachings, already wanted to go around, shining and pontificating, in a frantic eagerness to appear as improved substitutes for Olavo de Carvalho. These are just the foam, soap bubbles that time will take care to undo. I still have a good number of serious students who continue preparing, silently, to do the good work in due time.